Today's topic for the session is Accelerate Application Modernization Journey using Azure Kubernetes Service. In the next 45 to 60 minutes, you will learn about introduction and architecture of Azure Kubernetes Service. We'll also discuss best practices in adopting Azure Kubernetes services, as well as finally, we'll touch upon how to monitor and optimize AKS. Before we start, let me highlight a few housekeeping items. During the webinar, please feel free to post questions using Q&A feature, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end. We are recording this session and we'll share the recording to you next 24 to 48 hours. With that, let me take this opportunity to introduce you to today's session speaker. Chris is the Director of Application Innovation at Microsoft, and he specializes in helping customers design, develop enterprise-scale cloud solutions using modern technologies such as Kubernetes, serverless, and PaaS. I also have Vineet, who is the Chief Technology Officer at Winwire, and he brings over 25 years of experience in the IT services industry. At Winwire, he manages the technical solutions team, envisioning new solutions, key customer engagement management, and also involved in architecting the solutions. So with that, before we actually get into the sessions, let me have a quick poll. Then we will directly get into the session. So people can take 30 seconds to submit your answers. A few more seconds. All right, I think we're getting a good number of responses. Let them keep coming. All right, we have good number of people taking the poll. Thanks again for taking time to answer these questions. And with this, I will let Chris take over the session from here. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, hey everybody. Just to reiterate, I'm on the Microsoft side. Actually going to turn my camera on just so you can see me wave my hands and flail about. But I'm on the Microsoft side. I'm based here in Denver, Colorado. I've been around Microsoft for about 5 years, software developer for 20 years before then. So been around the block, been doing AKS stuff or related stuff here at Microsoft, doing a lot of work with our customers. So I see a lot of what works, what doesn't work, understanding where the friction lies, where people run into problems and all of that. So my goal is to kind of parlay that into some knowledge that maybe you guys can take and use as you go down your journey with AKS, and really just get you familiar with some of that. So let's jump into it. I want to bounce out a couple more slides and let's talk a little bit about Kubernetes, right? I mean, Kubernetes is hard and it's not for everybody. It's not for every organization. It's not the right solution for every use case. So we often get asked about that. You know, when should I be thinking about Kubernetes? What should the considerations be? And this is a flow chart that we kind of put together with Winwire. I think you can find it out there if you search the internet, but it's really meant to give you some guidance into how you should think about Kubernetes and when it does make the right sense. And you'll notice that AKS or Kubernetes down there in the bottom right side of that slide is just one of a half dozen different options that we would kind of recommend depending on what you're looking for. So I won't try and walk you through the whole thing, but you know, you can kind of get the idea that, you know, we start as this new app, greenfield, brownfield, then we go from there, is it containerized? Obviously, to be Kubernetes efficient and proficient, we're always in container land, so we want to make sure that works. But at the end of the day, we want to really think about Kubernetes in terms of an organization-wide solution, right? I mean, in a lot of cases, we run into customers that are trying to take on Kubernetes for a single application, or one small team is trying to stand up Kubernetes and run it. And while that can work and it can be efficient, where you really get the most benefit as an organization is when you start to adopt Kubernetes across the stack, right? So some of this becomes or may change a little bit depending on if you are a Kubernetes company or you're not a Kubernetes company. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the benefits of Kubernetes, right? There are some of this can be misleading, like the infrastructure abstraction. Like, I think that's a little misleading. You don't ever get all the way out of the IaaS world if you're using Kubernetes. If you roll your own Kubernetes, then you are certainly dealing with tons of hardware and IaaS type virtual machines. If you're using a managed service, you still have to deal with some of that. So that infrastructure abstraction is important, but it's not a prime consideration. Things like declarative configuration, scheduling, right? I mean, those are really the two of the tenets of Kubernetes, being able to write YAML files and schedule and orchestrate your containers. That is the benefit of Kubernetes. That's kind of day one type stuff, right? But then when we start thinking about application innovation and how we can make our teams go faster and make our org more resilient and able to keep up with competition, we start thinking about velocity and how can our developers capitalize on the tooling and the ecosystem around Kubernetes to go faster. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into it. Self-healing, scalability, I mean, I think those are inherent to Kubernetes as well. You probably have some familiarity with how Kubernetes does that, but won't jump into that too much, but certainly hit us up offline if you want to talk more about that. So why do we use Kubernetes? What are some of the best use cases for that? Top left, right? I mean, that's a big one, especially these days where all the organizations are trying to cut costs, consolidate, whatnot, right? So cost savings. How can I get better density out of my cloud resources? How can I cram more compute or more workloads into the same number of virtual machines or fewer virtual machines, right? So Kubernetes is great for that. If I can containerize my apps and I can kind of lift and shift them up to Kubernetes, I can get a lot of benefit that way. Microservices, right? I mean, that's the quintessential use case for Kubernetes, right? I mean, that's the Netflix of the worlds and some of those other services that you read about that are all built entirely on microservices. That's why Kubernetes works great for them. Secure DevOps and automation, right? I mean, the ability to use a combination of infrastructure as code and things like GitHub pipelines, automation, right? To scaffold out a Kubernetes cluster and then deploy all my applications on top of that. I mean, again, that just talks to the velocity and the efficiency I can gain from that. And because if I'm using Kubernetes across my organization, all of that starts to feel the same, right? I mean, all my application deployments start to feel the same. I don't have a bunch of bespoke pipelines. I don't have a bunch of weird build processes. It's always build the container, put the container on Kubernetes, right? Machine learning. I mean, machine learning is top of mind for everybody these days with ChatGPT. That all is empowered by running Kubernetes, right? Getting that density, using those huge virtual machines with GPUs and capitalizing on that orchestration to be able to orchestrate your machine learning initiatives. IoT, we're not going to talk much about that today, but certainly with IoT and even data streaming, you can really capitalize on Kubernetes and the ability to orchestrate things like Kafka or IT data sensor collection, all of that. Next slide. But when we go to Kubernetes, we immediately start to face a variety of challenges, right? Make no mistake that Kubernetes is hard. Organizations struggle with it every day. You know, I would say customers that try and bootstrap Kubernetes internally without any help have a 50% success rate, right? I mean, it is hard. You need a guide, you need someone there, whether you hire a team or you bring in a team, you partner with a company like Windwire, you've got to have somebody there to hold your hand. And it's because of all this complexity you see here. You know, I'm not going to go through all of them, but security, I mean, the things that were in the poll, security, logging, the cross-cutting concerns. I think the big one is the lack of Kubernetes skills, right? I just mentioned that. Being able to find Kubernetes experts that have been through the process, that have bootstrapped or helped bootstrap an organization from not using Kubernetes to being an efficient Kubernetes organization. That takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of tribal knowledge, and finding those skills is tricky, right? Resource constraints, storage, DevOps. I mean, when we start talking about GitOps, I'm not going to get into that a whole lot today, but GitOps is a flavor of DevOps that is specific to Kubernetes. You know, more of a declarative pull-based approach rather than a push-based approach. Sorry if that doesn't make a lot of sense. I'd love to talk to y'all for a whole hour about GitOps, but probably don't have time for that today. And then network policy, right? I mean, all those things add to the complexity. Next slide. So why is Kubernetes complex? Well, this is, I mean, you can read the stuff on the left side. You know, Kubernetes at a very high level is kind of broken into two halves. On one half, you have this control plane kind of on the left side of the diagram. And on the right side, you have all your worker nodes, right? So immediately you can just see all the moving pieces there. You've got things like the control plane that manages all the master nodes and the etcd database. It has, you know, the brains of the operation, if you will. And on the right side, you kind of have the scale out, the workers, right? I mean, those can come in a million different flavors, different sizes. You can slice and dice into multiple node pools so that you can have, for example, GPUs running in one set of worker nodes, but not in another. So all up, you can imagine how complex that is. And so that's where something like AKS comes into play, right? So when you come to Azure and you start looking at AKS, AKS is Microsoft's managed Kubernetes platform. You know, what we try and do is that diagram that we just saw on the previous screen, we try and consolidate all of that control plane stuff into something you really don't even have to worry about, right? I mean, that is AKS in a nutshell. And that leaves you really just the right side that you have to worry about. And by giving you automation tools, APIs, and all of that kind of thing, we try and make that as easy as possible. Still not easy, not totally simple, but it is definitely easier to use a managed service than it is to try and roll your own AKS or your own Kubernetes. So a couple quick benefits, you know, we automate patches and updates. We kind of assimilate some of the high availability DR type stuff. We try and make it easy for you to secure that, the self-healing stuff. You know, we'll kind of be able to monitor when nodes go down, all that kind of stuff. And then a lot of the cross-cutting concerns like monitoring and that kind of thing. So go ahead and switch to the next slide. So when that's all said and done, Kubernetes on Azure, we try and make that enterprise ready, right? So a lot of this I just mentioned, developer productivity, there's a whole ecosystem out there around making AKS and Kubernetes accessible to developers, efficient, right? Multi-layer security, we'll talk about that here in a minute. Operational efficiency, unified management. I mean, those are all just four of probably a dozen pillars that we could talk about when it comes to AKS that we try and bake into the product to make it easier for you all on an enterprise level to adopt that across your organization. So let's talk a little bit about those four pillars real quick. So developer productivity. right? I mean, this is what's near and dear to my heart because I spend a lot of time talking to the teams that are building apps for the cloud. You know, the Microsoft ecosystem here, and when I say Microsoft, it's not just Microsoft. I mean, a lot of this is stuff that Microsoft sponsors, but it's out there in the open source community. It's stuff that Microsoft maybe championed and then brought to the open source community. And some of it's, you know, unrelated to Microsoft, right? But the point there is that there's a huge ecosystem of developer productivity and tools that you can use when you're thinking about building apps and modernizing apps for Kubernetes. So Draft is, you know, I'll leave it to you guys, go do a little bit of research on that, but it makes it real easy to kind of bootstrap an application from scratch. We've got GitHub and GitHub Actions, which have tons of pre-built modules and tasks and jobs that make it easy to deploy to Kubernetes. Visual Studio Code, I'm guessing a lot of you have used that. Things like autocomplete on your Kubernetes manifests and IntelliSense and all the good stuff that comes with that, not to mention things like GitHub Copilot, which will just write the stuff for you, right? So Kata is a huge open source product, kind of a scaling mechanism. Think serverless, if you're familiar with like Azure Functions and being able to scale and scale out workloads. Kata is a big part of that. And then Dapper is really cool, right? I mean, Dapper is a scaffolding product that allows you to abstract away your cloud native services. So, you know, imagine being able to abstract your application to use Azure storage queues on one can, but then for a lot of our ISV customers, they also need that same application to work on AWS using AWS simple queues, right? So Dapper gives you the ability to bake that into your code from the standpoint that I don't have to take those external dependencies in my code. I just take the Dapper dependency and then I use configuration as an aside to then wire all that up to the cloud native service. So really important product if you're thinking about using cloud agnostic products or you want to be independent of your cloud vendor and things like that. All right, next slide. Multi-layer security, right? I mean, no brainer these days. Everything's always under attack. If you have any kind of public endpoint out there, you probably know you're getting hammered away, right? So everything Microsoft does takes security as a first-party solution. We have options, you know, Microsoft Defender, things in Active Directory, networking things with private link. You can kind of see up there, container scanning, right? So being able to scan those containers. And that's not a one-time thing, right? I mean, I need to be able to make sure that what was a safe container a week ago remains a safe container today as new vulnerabilities are defined or identified on the underlying base images and things like that. So the whole process of being able to secure the pipeline from my source code all the way out to what's running on my actual clusters, you know, Microsoft provides a bunch of tools there. So next slide. Operational efficiency, right? I mean, day two type stuff. How do I maintain my clusters and keep them up and running? How do I take on some of the more advanced features? How do I monitor this thing? Azure has what we call container insights. I think Vineet's going to talk about that a little bit. But all in all, tons of monitoring, cross-cutting concerns that are meant to make Kubernetes more efficient in your organization. Let's go to unified management. Again, same kind of thing, right? I mean, here's where, if you're familiar with this concept of Flux or GitOps, you'll realize that Microsoft has baked into our AKS product the ability to just with a simple click of a button or a simple line in an infrastructure as code file, you can add in the whole GitOps requirement, all the agent or the containers and controllers that run that and wire that up. Things that really make the more advanced type of stuff that you want to do very simple and easy to run. We also have a bunch of stuff you can see down on the bottom there, Azure Stack, on-prem, multi-cloud, edge, right? I mean, you can take AKS and you can actually run it on your own servers in your own data center, right? So there's a lot of cool things we can do with that. And then when it's all said and done, you know, it kind of boils down to the whole ecosystem here. Vinny, you can go ahead and just click through that real quick. But we've talked about security, we've talked about the developer tools, we've talked about the platform management. If you don't like AKS, you can go with Azure Red Hat, or we call it Arrow, right? So if your organization's already using or connected with Red Hat, you can use it that way. So, but it's an entire ecosystem. It's all there meant to run, to help you run Kubernetes more efficiently, safer, more secure, more scalable. And hopefully we bring a lot of those tools to the table to make that easy for you. Vineet, do you want to kind of get into some of the best practices here and next, the next level of depth? Yeah, please.
Absolutely, Chris. Thank you very much. And folks, as Noor mentioned in the beginning, please do feel free to ask any questions in the chat window. We will address them at the end of the session. Chris, thank you very much for covering a good overview. Appreciate that. Folks, as Noor introduced in the beginning, my name is Vineet Arora. I am the CTO and the co-founder of Envire Technologies. We are a premier Microsoft partner, work very closely with Microsoft. I myself used to be in Microsoft for many years, but that was ages ago. But I run our technology solutions team, and glad to be on this call. So good afternoon, good morning, or good evening to certain folks if you're joining from other side of the world. In addition to what Chris covered, what I wanted to talk about is just few best practices and topics that are very close to our experience on how AKS is being adopted across the customer, right? So when I look at customers' adoption, right, how AKS helps, you have already heard about scenarios, everything from container orchestration to making sure that when you're thinking about cloud native applications, right, the core infrastructure is already provided, but also the CI/CD that is built into the whole AKS infrastructure, right? But the customers that we see, many of them, you saw the diagram at the beginning, right? Very much the sort of workflow, right? Building greenfield applications, and folks who may not be aware of the greenfield as a term that is used is, new breed, innovative applications, microservices-based applications, customers that are looking at solving their business problems using cloud-native applications, right? Including advanced scenarios where they need to have regular updates to that particular application for their customers. AKS provides a very, very important platform for that. Now, when you're building that platform, the 3-4 items on which you responded to your poll, right? I looked at that, and seems like security and scaling, which are 2 of the key features of AKS, stood out. And I will cover on a couple of them. But there is also certain things around cost management, certain things around monitoring, right? You cannot take certain decisions about scaling or security unless and until you monitor them, right? So I'll talk a little bit about that. And a lot of this is something that we can follow up with you for your individual scenarios. I'm giving you a generic overview of what we have seen our customers. When we have worked with our customers, what have we seen in their scenarios? But if there are specific scenarios, you are already using AKS, or you're at least using Kubernetes in some other cloud platform, and you're thinking about how AKS can help, we can talk about that. When we look at AKS to be used in a greenfield application scenario, 3 sort of topics come out very, very clearly. Chris talked about very importantly that some of these are part and parcel of the AKS as a service itself, it provides. Even then, I think there is a need for you to, as a customer, you as the architect, as the developer, right, to think about some of these elements, because even within AKS, there are configurations and there are setups that you will need to do. There are deployment scripts that you will need to do, which will ensure that you're using the AKS in the best possible manner, right? So one of them is all around cluster architecture and design, right? I'm not going into the definition of clusters and namespaces and everything else, but those are the basic concepts of Kubernetes, assuming some of you who are on this call or all of you are at least aware of those. If not, please be, we will include like an appendix in this session when we share out the deck and the video recording, and you can at least know about them, but they are very well documented. Thinking about the multi-tenant design, how do you need to deploy your application across horizontal or vertical, or maybe most of the customers are looking at SaaS-based applications. How does AKS going to be set up for that is very, very important to be thought about, right? Upgrade, right? We talked about that most of these applications have to be looked at it from a upgrade on a regular basis, right? What are the policies around upgrades that you should be very well defined, right? Ingress, right? You're looking at load balance. When the data is coming in, how are you managing those? And then, of course, lots of other policies that have to be looked at is where you're accessing certain databases, you're accessing certain cache, which are outside the AKS environment. How do you make sure that that is not slowing down your overall application while AKS is supposed to provide you the scalability, but that data exchange is not slowing it down? Remember, nothing still replicates the need for having a good application design, right? Now, when you're designing an application, right, assuming a web application, right, you have to still think about simple things like application types, right, the stateful, stateless, and all of those. While they will be hosted into an AKS cluster, right, these are still the things that are very important. And one of the important things in the AKS scenario is something called pod design. There are patterns that are published, and we have seen, those pod patterns, again, depending on your scenario, depending on how the customers are accessing the applications, where are they accessing it from, which features are there. And I'll talk about it in a few slides on how do you monitor them and then go back and then optimize your pod. But identifying the right pattern, understanding the correct life cycle, and making sure that auto scaling, which is again important, is configured correctly, right? So that your AKS deployment is being fully utilized. As I saw in the poll, right, and it is clearly, Chris also touched upon that, security and of course associated with it, networking is very critical to think about. Before you deploy any AKS environment, our learning has been is thinking through a complete policies, very well-defined security architecture for the AKS. Unlike not only AKS, but for any other application today is very important. But in AKS, I will cover one dedicated slide where I will talk about some of the important things that you need to pay attention to. That is very important in deploying an AKS cluster. Networking topology, right? Chris also touched upon that, very important. There are multiple options that are available to you. Remember, there are lots of open source technologies that are part and parcel of Kubernetes as a platform, right? It is open source in itself, but how do you ensure that if you're using the AKS scenario, right, the right networking information is being used? I have a slide on that I'll show you. So as I heard about the poll, right, and it's not something that I've created slides on the fly, but scaling and securing your AKS cluster are the most important thing, right? That's what I heard, right? Think about autoscaler objects, right? Making sure that you have it as up to date as possible, right? As I said, the application design, right? How do you design your application? That is very important. There are other best practices around managing your group instances, right? So that if you are defining group instances with a particular RAM and other configurations, right, they are all together, right? So that they are not going to be different kinds of performance that you will get from others as such. Coming to the securing part of it, right? This is one sort of a complicated architecture diagram, and I'm not going to go into each and every element of that architecture. But what you will see is that, and the link that you see at the top has more details around the security baseline that you can set it up for AKS. But things like, outside the AKS technology, on the Azure environment, technology services that are available like Azure Firewall, Key Vault, Azure Bastion, you have to think about virtual network, right? Without a properly configured virtual network, right? It doesn't really make sense. I'm not explaining everything that is there in the slide, but I'm highlighting the things that I think are important for you to understand. AKS, while AKS is right here in the middle as a small of the small service out here, there's a lot of other configurations that you need to do to make sure that your ultimate benefits of AKS is important. One of the other ones that I'll talk about is capturing logs. If you don't capture logs, right, which is not even like a choice, but if you capture logs, right, that's what is going to help you monitor. In the monitoring part of it, I'll cover in the next slide. In the monitoring part of it, you'll be able to see how your AKS cluster is performing. Go back and change some of these parameters as are required, either for securing or for scaling that is required as such. So as I said, moving on to on the monitoring part of it, right? Two, three things that I want to talk about. One, which gets a little bit overlooked, right? Cost management. Like now, Azure Container Services, right, which are also available to you as pay as you go, right? So but you're paying the cost for underlying infrastructure that is as a part of it, storage, VMs, networking, everything else, right? Now, when you're building a solution using Azure Kubernetes Services, you want to run it for a long duration, but you also don't want to have a shock of the build that, oh, I wanted to have a scalable architecture, but if I have to pay through my nose for that, right, it doesn't really make sense. And your CFO or CIO may question, why did you choose that particular technology? There are options available to you, right, based upon what Microsoft provides as reserved instances. You may have already been aware of it. This is not just specific to AKS, but of course, you can choose 1 year, 3 year reserved instances that are at a much better cost. There are spot virtual machines that you can spin up. There are saving plans based upon when you work with Microsoft to say, we are going to have so many applications, we are going to have so much of data, we are going to have so much of commitment, and there are discount options that are available or savings that are available that you can look at it. You could also look at on your own, right? How do you probably maybe half your AKS cluster cost so that you can still utilize Azure as your platform for other services, right? There are cost optimization design principles. We just talked about some of them on the left side, which are the options, but there are things around right sizing your VMs, right? Making sure you're not running your VMs or your cluster always at a high end when you don't need it. Auto scaling, right? You want to use some of the preset cluster configurations because those are already optimized from the right set as such. Some of the things that is not very intuitive, but stop the cluster that you don't need to be running, right? And there are automations that you can build to achieve some of those or some of those start and stop, right? Now, you will say that my application is always live, and while it may be true, for many scenarios, it is not necessarily true for all aspects of your application, right? So if you're doing a batch job processing, right, and if you have deployed it on an AKS cluster, that does require scaling, but it does not need to be up and running every time. You can spin it up when the need comes in and automate the spot VMs that we already talked about as such. Chris just briefly touched upon that. I'm not going to go into too much details, but as you deploy your AKS clusters, right, Azure provides an inbuilt Azure cluster insights. And I've just given you a couple of screenshots of what it provides. It will give you everything that you need to know about the Azure AKS cluster so that you can actually make certain decisions, right? Like you at the bottom, you're seeing, right? There is one of them which is running all fine, but it is telling you how much of the CPU is being used, how many containers are there, how much uptime it has been. So you can do various slicing and dicing in this inbuilt reports and dashboards that are available as a part of the AKS Insights and make certain decisions. Maybe, I shouldn't be running it for so long. Maybe this is being underutilized, and I should sort of reduce the amount of resources that I have allocated to them. So many of those are available as a part of Azure Insight. At the same time, At the same time, there are it was building. At the same time, there are other tools, right? There are other tools that Kubernetes environment does provide, which are still possible to be used even with the AKS scenarios, right? So there is Grafana, Jagger that we have used that we are, sort of very happy with in terms of, in addition to the Azure Insight, right? These are built for the Kubernetes infrastructure that you could potentially use. But some of these best practices that are listed out here are the ones that we suggest that you look at implementing in your scenarios. I think with that, what we will like to do is summarize. We will of course be available, right, for answering any questions. You heard about a lot of things around what AKS can do. When you're looking at a particular scenario, a particular business problem that you have, how can we help you, right? Why Winwire? And of course, Microsoft is the core platform. We have been doing this for many years. We have been recognized by Microsoft for being one of the key partners, and more than happy to have a follow-up conversation for your specific business scenarios where it will be good for us to understand your business problem and provide you the solution which AKS could potentially solve. We'll open up for Q&A at this point in time, and Noor, let us know if there are any questions that Chris or I can answer, and we can go from there.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Vineet, for taking up this session. Really informative, and I see a few questions already coming in. I think the first and foremost coming from John is, can I move or migrate my cluster between Azure tenants?
Chris, you're on mute, I think.
Yeah. Okay, while Chris checks his mic, I request folks to type in your questions in the Q&A chat, and or like even in the chat. We'll take those questions right away.
Yeah, I don't know, Noor, if you also muted Chris along with others.
Just give me one sec. No, he is still in the organizer.
Okay, maybe you can type the answer in the chat window.
That's right.
I think that may make sense. I can read it out for others. Q&A seem to be disabled for certain people, but I think it has been enabled now. Yeah, the personal email ID, Daniel. Okay, no issues. That's fine. So I think technology helps, right? Not always helps, right? So as I say, somebody said demo gods, and I said demo gods actually live in hell, right? But I think to answer from our side, yes, like any other resources, there is a possibility to do some of those, movement. Okay, it's still disabled for folks. Noor, can we look into it? Why is it disabled for certain folks? Probably it's they're joining through.
No, it's enabled for all. I can see people typing in the Q&A, or maybe if you guys can put in the questions in the chat window, I think we can take those questions as well.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
We can.
Sorry,
That's
never
okay.
fails. As soon as I'm on an important Teams call, my microphone seems to go belly up. But so just real quick, back to Rajat's question about can I move or migrate my cluster between Azure tenants? I think the short answer is unfortunately probably not. That would just the fact that you're So your Azure subscription is then linked to your tenant, right? And as soon as you start moving resources from tenant to tenant, all of the RBAC goes crazy and you lose, for example, your service principals get messed up and some of that kind of stuff. So, your best bet would likely be to be able to re-provision a new cluster the right way, migrate your workloads over, and go from there. But I think that goes back to one of the things we were talking about, and really being able to capture your or capitalize on the ability to automate that process. Whether you use Terraform or Bicep or ARM templates or whatever, right? I mean, define everything as infrastructure as code. Define your workloads that sit on top of the cluster as either pipelines or GitOps or something. And from that standpoint, then it makes moving and standing up new clusters much easier. So I know that's a long-winded answer, but that's probably the best answer I'd give you on that one.
You're right. You're right, and I will answer in addition to that is while theoretically it is possible, but you wouldn't be just doing more movement of resources. I think it requires a lot of planning and automation and using scripting and re-provisioning those resources, as Chris mentioned, using ARM templates or Terraform and everything else. I think you have to plan a lot around that, because you saw one of the architecture diagrams I showed you, right? It's not a simple deployment. AKS is not just like a storage that you're deploying, right? I'll bring this up for everybody's reference, right? AKS is just this piece, right? No application is going to be complete without all the networking, security, logging, frontline firewalls and everything else set up, right? So you just can't say, oh, move this out there and then it'll work. It actually cannot even be moved that easily. So you need to think about an entire solution architecture, and even the need for moving it has to be considered, right? Is there a need itself for moving it? Because you could have cross-tenant communication through APIs and other mechanisms that you can think about, but you may not even need that.
Yeah.
I know some people were having issues with the Q&A, but I see a bunch of folks have been able to put it, use the chat window. Please put your Q&A in the chat window if that is what is required.
Great. Thanks, Vineet.
Okay.
And thanks, Chris, for taking up that questions. So
I think there is a question from Veera around like thinking moving between data centers. Yes. So if you're talking about cloud data centers, if you're talking about maybe moving between one geolocation to other geolocation, it will still be a re-provisioning of all the resources that are required. So you should be looking at scripting their entire environment and then re-provisioning it with all the right security, networking configurations, and everything else which are true for that particular environment.
Yeah, I would on the topic.
Cluster
Real quick on the topic too.
There is a question which is interesting for me. How do we scale AKS cluster to 0?
You can do that now. So that it wasn't there in the beginning, but over. Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes, please continue.
Okay, yeah. So over recently, meaning maybe the last year or year and a half, we have added the ability that you can essentially scale down to 0 your number of worker nodes in your cluster. So it's pretty straightforward. You can use a CLI command, you can use your infrastructure as code, or even just the portal, but you can scale down to 0. So now, obviously, being able to scale down to 0 is different than how do you operationalize that? If you're keeping stateful data, how do I then reattach that data and rehydrate and things like that? So usually the scale to 0 comes into play when we're talking about dev test and, for example, turning things off at night to save money. But yes, the answer is you can do that.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Vineet. So the other question what I have is, how do I limit the access to Kubernetes API server? Is there a way that we can limit the access?
Yeah, so there's a few different ways you can do that. We have this, kind of a fork in the road. You can either create a private cluster or what amounts to a public cluster. The public cluster just simply meaning that the API surface area for AKS has a public endpoint. For probably 75% of our customer use cases, that's fine. And then the other direction on that fork is to create what's called a private cluster, where that API endpoint gets brought internal to your virtual network. It creates a lot of friction just because now I've got to have things like bastion machines and some different routing techniques and all that kind of stuff. But in that scenario, that is locked up. I can definitely ensure that nobody can get to that unless they're coming through the my private network. That's usually where you get into like the compliance things for financial or insurance applications, medical, things like that. So yes, you can do that. Yes, it is a little bit more work and it creates some more operational overhead, but it can be done. And then if you use the public version, you can lock that down with access lists. So basically IP filtering and whitelists and some things like that to make sure that it's still very secure, right? So it really comes down to what level of compliance and security you require.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for taking up that question as well. So other follow-up question is like, can I have different virtual machine sizes in a single cluster? Is that something possible?
Yeah, so in a node pools or in Kubernetes, there's this concept of a node pool, which is a group of identical virtual machines, or in Azure speak, it's a virtual machine scale set. So within a node pool, they all have to be the same, but I can create multiple node pools with different specs per node pool. So, I think the example I gave earlier was I may need one node pool with 5 machines that has GPUs because they're expensive and I need that for my machine learning. But then my other node pool that I'm just using to serve up web traffic can be just real basic general compute machines, and I may need 50 of those. So yes, you can do that.
Perfect. Thanks. While I take one more question, I will ask folks to again keep continuing to type in your questions in the chat window, and we will take up those questions. So one other question what I have is, how does Kubernetes help to simplify the containerized deployment?
So, Vineet, I feel like I want to keep talking over you. Want me to take that?
I think that's certainly a very, very generic question, but I think the point about AKS is not so much about containerization. It's more about management of the containerization and everything around Kubernetes. I think that is more around at the Kubernetes level itself, right? So we are, as Chris covered it in the beginning, AKS simplifies your development, deployment of complex scalable applications. Containers is built into that particular model itself. So you're using Kubernetes as the container technology in that, and AKS is providing you all the other services around that, so that your focus can be more on the application development rather than management of that particular cluster. Great. I think with that, we are on the time. Folks, thank you very much. Somebody was asking about WinWire, and we have that slide up for a while. If you're able to see who WinWire is, everybody knows who Microsoft is. I am the CTO with WinWire, folks who joined late, and Chris is with Microsoft. Thank you for spending your time with us. You will get the video recording, audio-video recording of this particular session, and appreciate all the questions.
Thank you so much and have a good day. Thanks for taking time to join this session.
Thanks, everyone.